The whole idea behind hardcore punk is that it was the continuation of the authentic spirit of punk rock. By 1979, punk had already been completely deconstructed. The Sex Pistols had broken up, Sid Vicious would die that year, The Clash and The Damned were playing different musical genres, disco was dominant, and hip-hop would soon emerge in the New York underground scene. The general consensus was that former and current punks began swapping their ripped jeans, safety pins, and mohawks for the suits, hair gel, and thin pink ties of the new romantics, experimenting with pop music and art by creating new wave and post-punk. Also, quite a few of them were considered to have betrayed the scene by signing with major record labels and embarking on well-paid global tours. Hardcore stood in direct contrast to all of this. From the beginning, it was against multinational corporations, against the music industry, against getting rich from music, against rock stars, but also against the new musical trends, the silly, abstract lyrics, and naive artsy and pop experimentation. Its philosophy from the beginning was purely DIY, to which straight edge would soon be added, meaning complete abstinence from alcohol and drugs. Other general characteristics of the movement will be its strongly urban base. From the beginning, the style developed mostly in the major urban centers of the United States: New York, Washington, Boston, Los Angeles. It spread to the suburbs at most, but never extended to the small towns and villages of the countryside. Then came the strong localism and organization into scenes. Due to the uncompromising DIY ethos, the movement was organized into scenes which, due to the limited means of communication at the time, remained strictly confined to the cities from which they originated, creating many local heroes but very few national celebrities. Furthermore, there was a definite male dominance. From the genre's inception, band members were overwhelmingly male, unlike the original punk and the genres that emerged from it: post-punk, new wave. Finally, the strong sense of independence. The DIY spirit was in everything. Band members functioned as composers, musicians, producers, record label owners, managers, tour managers, cover and t-shirt designers, and whatever else was needed. As one can understand, the genre was particularly political, with the dominant direction being the extreme left and anarchism and everything associated with them. Hardcore punk lyrics often expressed messages against militarism, the establishment, violence, authoritarianism, discrimination, and in favor of environmental protection and equality. A constant source of inspiration for the scene were the leaders of America and Britain, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, as well as their conservative economic policies, known as Reaganomics and Thatcherism, respectively. The atmosphere of hyper-consumerism, individualism, and excess that characterized the 80s, the middle class, yuppies, and their lifestyle were often targeted by the scene. The live performances of the hardcore punk bands were also very characteristic, as friendly violence among the attendees was a given. In the early 1980s, the so-called slam dancing, also known as moshing, developed, where concert-goers hit or push each other, as well as the so-called stage diving, where fans of the bands climbed onto the stage and then jumped into the crowd below. These habits were intended to reduce the distance between the audience and the artist, to oppose the bland and flat culture of the middle class, but also to parody the true violence of mass gatherings. These practices would become globally known a few years later when they were incorporated into the thrash metal culture, which would become much more widespread among the youth of the time. Certainly, one way in which hardcore opposed original punk was through the fashion in which scene members dressed, or rather the absence of it, especially in America. The band members dressed very simply, practically like an ordinary young person of the same age, in jeans, t-shirts, and sneakers, and without anything that would make them stand out. In the UK, things were a bit different, as spiky hair, mohawks, boots, and anarchist symbols continued to be used in the attire of many hardcore bands in that scene. Finally, we should also say a few things about how bands released their work, which perfectly aligned with the mentality we just analyzed. It's no coincidence that the four most important record labels of the scene were founded by musicians who belonged to it. Discord Records by Ian MacKaye of Minor Threat, Alternative Tentacles by Jello Biafra of the Dead Kennedys, Epitaph Records by Brett Gurewitz of Bad Religion, and SST Records by Greg Ginn of Black Flag, while Touch and Go Records started as a self-published fanzine of the same name. The general philosophy of the movement was that the record labels producing its works should operate based on a DIY ethic, collaboration, financial trust, and an emphasis on creative freedom. The simplest definition given to the genre was a form of hard, extreme punk rock. Indeed, the genre originated from the search for a more authentic punk sound. But the truth is that the above definition is very abstract and simplistic. The traditional singer, guitarist, bassist, drummer format is followed here too, but from there on, many things are different. Punk, at least in its early days, was arguably still clearly connected to the original 1950s version of rock and roll, something like a crazier, more modern version of Chuck Berry. Hardcore was a radical change on that. It wasn't traditional verse-chorus rock. It shattered every idea about what rock songwriting was supposed to be. It was something special from the very beginning. The general plan of the bands was indeed to play louder, harder, and faster, but not just in relation to punk, but in relation to anything else that existed in rock at the time. It was a style of music that from the beginning emphasized on speed and rhythmic extremity, using unpredictable song forms and abrupt tempo changes. It sought out an extreme intensity, reaching a level of threatening, powerful noise and a relentless, strong rhythm, instead of the typical elements of mainstream rock music, such as harmony and tonality, that is, melody. Stage singers often shouted or screamed, and it wasn't uncommon for groups to utilize chanting vocals reminiscent of mob slogans, with what were called gang vocals. As for the guitarists, they often played power chords at a very fast tempo, using a heavily distorted and amplified sound, creating what has been called a buzzsaw sound. Although the scene generally avoided excessive technical display, there were many times when we heard complex, technically proficient, and rhythmically demanding guitar parts. The guitar's melodic lines usually applied the same minor scales that the singers used. Although it later became a kind of taboo for subsequent scenes, hardcore guitarists did play some solos, although certainly fewer than in mainstream rock. The sound of the drums was likely the most prominent feature of the scene's sound, the most essential element in achieving the aggressive and relentless fury. Hardcore drummers played tightly with the other musicians, especially the bassists. For example, synchronized tempo changes were used in many important hardcore albums. One of the most important drumming styles of the scene was D-beat, inspired by the British band Discharge. It is defined by a continuous 4/4 rhythm, with the bass drum hitting on 1 and 3 and the snare on 2 and 4, creating a dynamic, anthemic, and polyrhythmic feel. This style of playing formed the rhythmic basis for the thrash metal genre. The scene's general independence and nonconformism, compared to the more insular punk rock, quickly brought it closer to various other musical genres that were flourishing in the underground. One of those was heavy metal. We have already mentioned in the video on the style how the combination of the heavier side of the new wave of British heavy metal with the aggression of hardcore punk gave rise to the thrash metal genre. However, the collaboration between the two scenes didn't stop there. Black Flag, one of the legendary bands of the style, dedicated the second side of their 1984 album, My War, to a kind of tribute to Black Sabbath, while at the same time, members of the band helped bring to prominence Saint Vitus, one of the most important founding names of the doom metal style. This mixing didn't end there. As we'll see later, it continued from both scenes, giving rise to genres like crossover thrash, beatdown hardcore, sludge metal, and later, metalcore. Besides metal, the scene showed a connection with the then emerging hip-hop style early on, initially within the New York music scene. The two movements had many commonalities such as DIY, an anti-establishment philosophy, aggressive energy, and raw, socially conscious lyrical content. Proof and pioneers of this meeting were the bands Bad Brains and Beastie Boys, who started as a hardcore punk band. The results of this coexistence were evident in the influences of musical genres such as beatdown hardcore and punk rap. Let's not forget that in the early 90s, a commercially very successful combination of element from hardcore, metal, and hip-hop developed with bands like Biohazard, Propane, Sick of It All, Suicidal Tendencies on their album Lights, Camera, Revolution, and Body Count, finding its ultimate completion and success in Rage Against the Machine. The roots of the genre don't need to be analyzed as much as for other scenes we've examined. They obviously overlap with those of punk, 60s garage rock, the Seeds, the Trogs, the Sonics, the Standells, the Shadows of Night, Count 5, and many others. Now, according to Jello Biafra himself, none of these 60s bands came close to be considered proto-hardcore, except one. He has said, Sound of Imker Train of Doomsday single in the late 60s in Holland. The only true 60s hardcore record I know. Then, of course, let's not forget the MC5, the Velvet Underground, the Stooges, and the New York Dolls. Perhaps it's worth mentioning the first wave of punk as well, with bands like Television, the Dictators, the Heartbreakers, Richard Hell, and the Voidoids, the Cramps, and finally, of course, the Ramones. I won't mention more names since all the previous ones, as well as many of those who followed them, still had a clear connection to the most dangerous part of rock and roll and 50s music in general, a tradition from which hardcore punk completely broke away. I'll go straight to the releases that are considered to have started the hardcore punk scene. Black Flag from California released their first EP, Nervous Breakdown, in January 1979, although they had recorded it in 1978. Is it hardcore punk? Probably not. Both because Henry Rollins is missing. Keith Morris, later a member of the Circle Jerks, is on vocals. And because the sound hasn't yet escaped the shadow of punk rock. In the same month, another band from California, Middle Class from Santa Ana, will release their EP Out of Vogue. Here, we truly have a sound much closer to what would become hardcore punk, as it features both the classic shouting vocals and quite high speeds in 3 out of the 4 tracks of the disc. In October of the same year, the Germs from Los Angeles would release their album G.I., the first LP, which is exclusively categorized as hardcore punk on Rate Your Music. Here we have a sound that I don't know if it can be called exactly hardcore, but it's definitely not typical punk. Between these releases, in June 1979, the San Francisco band The Dead Kennedys had released the single California Über Alles / The Man with the Dogs. The first of the 2 songs is one of the scene's absolute anthems, while the second is closer to the traditional punk rock sound. 1980 is the year the scene began to find its footing and further wean itself from punk rock. That's when 2 absolute classic albums were released. Fresh Fruit for Rotting Vegetables by The Dead Kennedys and Group Sex by the Circle Jerks. The first one still had quite a few remnants of the classic punk sound, while the second one had many characteristics of authentic hardcore. We also had the second EP from both the Middle Class, Scavenged Luxury, and Black Flag, Jealous Again, where their sound evolved significantly toward what would make them famous. At the same time, however, we also had the first evidence that the sound found its way to areas outside of California. Firstly, toward the Great White North, with the appearance of DOA from Vancouver, Canada, and the album Something Better Change, where, of course, the sound isn't yet so clearly hardcore. One of the most significant developments will be the appearance of hardcore on the East Coast, and specifically the capital of the United States, with two landmark releases. In June, a former jazz fusion band consisting entirely of African Americans, Bad Brains, released the single Pay to Come/Stay Close to Me. The A-side is pure hardcore punk, while the B-side is reggae rock. The band will move to New York and continue more in the direction of the single's first side to become a true legend of the genre. In December, a band called the Teen Idols will release the EP Minor Disturbance, before breaking up and reforming in 1981 under a different name, which you might know, Minor Threat. Also, for the first time, we had the emergence of hardcore punk on the other side of the Atlantic, specifically in Great Britain, with the band Discharge from Stoke-on-Trent. In 1980, they will release two EPs, Realities of War in March and Fight Back in May. There are many people who say that these two EPs are truly the first appearance of the purest hardcore punk sound. I'm not entirely sure about that, not about whether they play hardcore, but about whether they were the first. Anyway, at least as far as the beginning of the scene is concerned, I'll stop here, as things will evolve very quickly in 1981, with a quadrupling of the total releases, singles, albums, EPs, belonging to the genre, so we'll need to examine them from a different perspective. Also that year, the release that is considered to have named the entire musical style will also come out, and it will be the album Hardcore 81 by the aforementioned Canadian band DOA. The analysis of the genre's golden age that follows will be done based on the scenes that developed, which, as we said, had a strong local character. The Ramones had toured the United States Capitol as early as 1976, and a significant, though not as famous, punk scene developed in the area from that year onward. As we saw, Bad Brains, who were the first hardcore punk band formed on the East Coast of the United States, came from the city. Their presence influenced a wave of new, much more aggressive bands. One of these was the Teen Idols, who formed in September of 1979 and disbanded in November of 1980, just before releasing the first EP to come out of the scene, which we saw in the previous chapter. Two members of the Teen Idols, Ian MacKaye and Jeff Nelson, very quickly formed Minor Threat, who made their live debut in December 1980. Minor Threat profoundly influenced the entire genre, with their contributions to music, ethics, aesthetics, and ethos being widely recognized by other hardcore bands to this day. Besides their sound, the other thing they became known for is the straight edge movement, inspired by their song Straight Edge, which was against alcohol and drug use and sexual promiscuity. This song inspired an entire generation of musicians who decided to abstain from all three, giving rise to a whole movement that still exists today. As we mentioned, MacKaye and Nelson founded their own record label, Discord Records, which released records by local bands. The most important of which was the compilation Flex Your Head, released in January 1982, a fundamental document of the scene as it existed in the early 1980s. Henry Rollins, who would become known as the singer of the California band Black Flag and a leading figure in hardcore punk worldwide, grew up in Washington, D.C., was influenced by the music of the Bad Brains, and was a childhood friend of Ian MacKaye. Some of the most important hardcore punk bands that were formed in the scene of the U.S. Capitol were the following. Starting with the Faith's EP Subject to Change, From 1983, some things began to change in the sound and the overall outlook of the scene. The violence and nihilism that had been associated with hardcore punk and overemphasized by the media seemed to add much pressure to the older bands and their musicians. This would lead to the so-called Revolution Summer of 1985, which would redefine many things, both musically and stylistically, introducing elements of melody or other musical genres into the classic DC hardcore sound. This evolution brought new bands to the forefront, such as Rites of Spring, Dag Nasty, Beefeater, and Grey Matter, giving birth to a musical genre that would be called post-hardcore or even emo-core, a term that originated by Thrasher magazine. This new genre would find its most successful expression in the capital, with bands from the late 80s such as Jawbox, Nation of Ulysses, Shudder to Think, and most importantly, of course, Ian MacKay's next band, Fugazi, whose 1990 album Repeater is considered a classic of the general American rock scene of the era.
California, over Alice, California, over Alice.
The West Coast of the United States witnessed the development of a very active punk scene between 1976 and 1978, so it seemed logical that this scene would give way to Southern California's hardcore punk scene from 1979 onward, with bands we've already examined as well as others like Vicious Circle and Fear. Hardcore bands and their fans were younger than the art punk audience of the original Los Angeles scene, and were primarily from the suburbs, South Bay, Orange County. This led to a rivalry between the two scenes. Those who belonged to the old Hollywood scene disliked the musical narrowness and violence of hardcore, while the suburban hardcore punks hated the lack of intensity, as well as the dependence on the fashions of the time exhibited by the Hollywood punks. All this dynamic is captured in Penelope Spheeris's documentary, The Decline of Western Civilization, filmed in 1979 and 1980, which included bands from both scenes. Regardless, in the early 80s in California, hardcore was clearly the dominant form of aggressive music. Notable bands of the scene at that time include the following:
I'm gonna shoot you, then you have your mind. Same old shit, maybe lies to do nothing. Some people they don't like you. Thursday morning, 7 a.m. Now fuck out in a garbage can. Told my mom I quit the scene and she got down. And you know me, I took the call, I hit it.
The hardcore punk scene, particularly in Los Angeles and Orange County, gained notoriety for concert violence and fan involvement in gangs. These issues even made it into episodes of popular TV series, Chips and Quincy M.E., in which, as expected, Los Angeles hardcore punks were portrayed as common criminals involved in murders and causing trouble. As a result, police presence at the scene's concerts increased, leading to violent clashes between police officers and attendees. Henry Rollins claimed that, from his experience, the police caused far more problems than they solved at hardcore shows. At one point, Black Flag themselves came under constant surveillance by the authorities, who were convinced the band was a front for a drug ring. All these events, as well as the change in young people's musical preferences, led to the decline of the scene by the mid-80s. Black Flag and the Dead Kennedys had broken up, TSOL, the Circle Jerks, Suicidal Tendencies, DRI, and Fear had changed their sound, although some bands like DI and the Adolescents continued. In 1985, another band of the scene, Bad Religion, re-emerged from a weird musical hiatus with the album Into the Unknown by releasing their second EP, Back to the Known. In this work, they infused their hardcore punk with elements of classic punk, skate punk, and melody. These musical choices will completely overshadow the hardcore side of their sound by the time of their 1989 album, No Control. The commercial success of this change will make the new bands emerging from the scene with names like Chemical People, Guttermouth, Jughead's Revenge, Lagwagon, The Offspring, Pennywise, Face to Face, and Big Drill Car, to follow in their footsteps, thus further diluting the original aggressiveness of the scene.
Warriors! Never forget the warrior!
The city was perhaps the most important center of the original punk scene in the United States, as the New York Dolls, the Ramones, Television, Richard Hell, and Patti Smith all started there. A very important event in the creation of the hardcore scene was the Bad Brains moving to the city in the early 80s. The first and most important hardcore band in the area was Agnostic Front, who formed in 1980 and released their first EP in 1983. Band members have stated that they were the first to use the term hardcore because they wanted to differentiate themselves from the city's punk scene, as they were street kids with a rougher edge. Besides them, the first generation of hardcore punk artists from the Big Apple started a bit later than their counterparts in Washington or California and included names like
Why don't you drink fucking beer? What's the matter? Are you quit? My head! Police! Brutality!
key gathering places for the scene were rock clubs like Max's Kansas City, The Ritz, and CBGB's. Along with the more typical hardcore bands, some names influenced by British-style anarcho-punk, both in sound and attitude, also emerged, such as Reagan Youth, False Prophets, Heart Attack, and especially Nausea, whose appearance led to the separation of the two scenes. The emergence of a distinct hardcore scene in New York not only gave birth to dozens of new bands, but also brought about a very strong stylistic shift toward metal. Thrash metal was born by an album from a band from San Francisco, recorded in the New York area where this band lived for quite a while. The influence of hardcore punk on Metallica was undeniable and has been recognized. The second band chronologically to release a thrash album, Slayer, even went so far as to record an entire album of hardcore punk covers. Soon, that gift will be returned, when the hardcore bands themselves would begin to be influenced by thrash, leading to the birth of crossover thrash. The most well-known early bands of the genre came from Southern California, Suicidal Tendencies, Texas via San Francisco, DRI, or North Carolina, Corrosion of Conformity. However, the album widely recognized as the first of that style came out of New York, specifically by SOD, Speak English or Die, summer 1985, and the area quickly became the center of the newly established genre, with bands like Leeway, Crumbsuckers, MOD, Nuclear Assault, Prong, Ludachrist, Cro-Mags, and Carnivore. Crossover thrash was very successful and influenced both genres it connected. In hardcore, it brought the silly, demented humor characteristic of many bands in the style, while in thrash, it introduced moshing and slam dancing as part of the broader culture of the genre. However, not everyone was satisfied. The emergence of this new style sparked reactions from old hardcore fans. For example, the release of the significantly more metallic album Cause for Alarm by Agnostic Front in 1986 drew criticism from many who accused them of selling out. And things didn't stop there, as an entire scene developed that opposed the metal influences being adopted in New York hardcore and preached a return to the authentic, punk-influenced hardcore sound. This movement was led by Youth of Today, whose 1985 song Youth Crew gave the entire movement its name. Other notable bands from this style were Gorilla Biscuits and Bold, plus Uniform Choice from California and Slapshot from Boston. Straight edge and vegetarianism were also key characteristics of the movement, which led many older members of the scene to reject it, and for it to become an isolated entity separate from the broader hardcore scene. Still, bands like Sick of It All and Warzone emerged from the Youth Crew scene who didn't necessarily follow all its elements, but proved to be highly influential. In the end, a band like Judge brought the scene to a 180-degree turn, as although they came from it, they heavily borrowed from heavy metal. Judge connects us with the next subgenre to emerge from the city. It was clear as early as the mid-80s that many new bands were cultivating a tough guy attitude and image through the use of aggression, the glorification of criminal violence, and a gang mentality. Over time, many of these bands began to develop a unique style that was more rhythm-based and less influenced by punk. The palm muting technique on guitar was a key factor in this sound, as were the gang vocals, heavy guitar riffs, and especially the tempo changes through repeated patterns in the middle of a song, known as breakdowns. Plus, when the vocals were not shouted or chanted, they had a clearly syncopated rhythm, obviously influenced by hip-hop. The movement was named Tough Guy Hardcore and is considered to have originated with the Judge EP, New York Crew, from 1988. Other bands that used this new sound were Sick of It All, Sheer Terror, Killing Time, Scarhead, Marauder, Biohazard, Propane, Yupicide, and Madball. Gradually, Tough Guy Hardcore became so prevalent in the New York scene that the style became widely known simply as New York Hardcore. The widespread adoption of the New York hardcore style brought with it a very distinct culture that became associated with the scene and which, to be honest, didn't have much to do with the original hardcore punk. This particular culture included the so-called crews, meaning close-knit groups of friends, band members, and various scene people, like for example Jerry DMS and Sunset Skins, plus gang ideology, tattoos, graffiti, and squatting. Very often, New York bands mentioned in their lyrics that they were from New York and its scene. In fact, a logo was even created for it, called the New York Hardcore logo, which includes the letters NYHC within the quadrants of an X shape. In the 90s, Tough Guy Hardcore evolved into what is known as beatdown hardcore, which placed even greater emphasis on low-tuned guitars, rhythm, and breakdowns. The genre is considered to have been pioneered by bands like Madball and Killing Time, and it was named after the Bulldoze album, The Final Beatdown, from 1996. Key representatives, beside Bulldoze themselves, were bands like Terror Zone, 1 Second Thought, 25 to Life, Hatebreed from neighboring Connecticut, as well as various bands from outside New York, such as Cold as Life from Detroit, Blood for Blood from Boston, One Life Crew from Cleveland, and No Innocent Victim from San Diego. I'll stop here because I think things have drifted too far from the genre's source, and I believe we need to go back a bit to the 80s and the more classic hardcore sound. The first appearance of bands that belonged to the hardcore punk scene in the United Kingdom occurred in the early 80s with a genre called UK82, which one could say continued the original punk sound by adding the powerful drumming and heavy guitar riffs of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, plus in particular Motorhead. The movement took its name from a song by its most prominent band, the Scottish The Exploited. As one can easily see just by looking at photos of the bands, this movement placed much greater emphasis on appearance compared to the corresponding scenes on the other side of the Atlantic. The term UK82 alternated with another, the so-called D-beat, which described, as we saw, the sound of the drums of the band Discharge. The band from Stoke-on-Trent was founded in 1977 and released its most significant work, the album Hear Nothing, See Nothing, Say Nothing, in 1982. This release had a profound influence on the entire sound of thrash metal, with Metallica and Anthrax covering songs from it, and Slayer and Sepultura citing it as an influence. Other bands that belong to the scene include the Varikers from Leamington, GBH from Birmingham, Chaos UK from Somerset, Subhumans from Trowbridge, Anti-Nowhere League from Kent, Disorder from Bristol, English Dogs from Grantham, and Vice Squad from Bristol. Generally, the mixing of hardcore punk sound with heavy metal came earlier for British bands and was considered as something natural, which did not provoke the reactions and criticism faced by American bands. For example, the album Troops of Tomorrow by The Exploited, which was released in 1982, already showed clear metal influences. It should be noted that other names were also used to describe the scene, such as street punk, for example. Reading the names of the areas from which the bands originated, we see another difference from the American scenes, as British bands did not come from the largest cities in the country, nor were they so concentrated in specific areas. Now, the mixing with metal soon brought about the development of new subgenres and scenes. The two most significant in the style we are examining in this video were the following. Crust punk emerged from the blend of punk rock and extreme metal. It found its most significant representatives in Amebix, from Devon, and Antisect, from the Northampton area. It took its name from the 1986 Hell Bastard demo, Ripper Crust. In the scene, we encounter names like Deviated Instinct, Concrete Socks, Electro Hippies, Doom, and Extreme Noise Terror. A peculiarity of the style is that musically, it was considered something distinct from hardcore punk, even though its bands were part of the hardcore punk scene as they played together at concerts, and both genres had a very aggressive sound. Through crust punk, the path was opened for the next subgenre, which would be none other than grindcore, which started from a band from Birmingham with roots in anarcho-punk Napalm Death. The genre combined the sound of crust punk with influences from underground extreme metal, creating a wall of noise that had never been heard before. The arrival of drummer Mick Harris in Napalm Death helped a lot with this. He played so incredibly fast that fans of the scene didn't know whether to take the band seriously or not. It was something incredibly chaotic, a step before absolute noise. British bands that followed this sound were Sore Throat, Unseen Terror, Bolt Thrower, and Carcass. Unlike crust punk, the genre quickly crossed the Atlantic with bands like Repulsion, Terrorizer, Macabre, and Righteous Pigs. The incredible extremity of the sound brought about completely unexpected developments, such as the sympathy shown for the style by the well-known British radio producer John Peel, or the experimentation with it by avant-garde jazz saxophonist John Zorn through his project Naked City. The genre would soon mix with the then newly emerging death metal, giving rise to subgenres like death grind, and in the future it would be fully adopted by the extreme metal community, which often makes us forget its hardcore punk origins. We will conclude our reference to the British scene by mentioning that there, the straight edge movement did not find the same response as in the United States. There were some band members who followed it, from bands like Napalm Death, Blitz, or Heresy, but the first group entirely made up of straight edge members was Voorhees, formerly Steadfast, who appeared in the early 90s. A scene will eventually develop in the Yorkshire area, inspired by the drummer of Sore Throat, Nicholas Royals, but it will not extend beyond the boundaries of that region. The most significant scene, apart from those we already mentioned, was that of Boston with bands like the FUs, the Freeze, Gangrene, Jerry's Kids, Siege, Negative FX, and SS Decontrol. Members of some of these bands, influenced by the straight-edge scene in Washington, would form the so-called Boston Crew, going so far as to physically assault those who used alcohol and drugs. From this group, the aforementioned band Slapshot will later be formed. In the rest of the United States, we had significant bands appearing in Minneapolis, Husker Du, The Replacements, Chicago, Articles of Faith, Naked Raygun, Detroit, Negative Approach, Portland, Oregon, Poison Idea, Final Warning, and in various other places throughout the country. As for the rest of the world, the most significant scene was obviously that of Canada, which, apart from DOA, included Dayglow Abortions, Subhumans, not to be confused with the British band of the same name, SNFU, and No Means No. Hardcore punk was one of the most significant scenes in what we could call aggressive rock in a global scale. The bands that belonged to this genre influenced and continue to influence thousands of musicians. Of course, the original sound changed a lot and gave rise to many subgenres, only some of which we examined in this video. For example, we mentioned very little to nothing about melodic hardcore, post-hardcore, sludge metal, power violence, emo, metalcore, or deathcore. All these genres are connected in one way or another to the original hardcore punk, some more, some less, some in sound, some in mentality, some in both. Personally, I wanted to stay as close as possible to the original sound as it emerged in 1979 and 1980. So I have no problem stopping here. I would like to emphasize that, in my opinion, what is thought of as the core sound among the metal community, used as a building block for styles like metalcore, deathcore, or slam death metal, is clearly the sound of New York hardcore slash tough guy hardcore slash beatdown hardcore, or whatever else you want to call it, as it developed in the second half of the 80s and gained success in the first half of the 90s. A key and highly controversial characteristic of all these genres is the very frequent use of the breakdown, while the image of the bands directly points to the older scenes. Anyway, hardcore punk is, was, and will always be a very important genre of music, without which no one can tell the complete story of heavy rock.